Hello, and welcome to Outras Economias, a non-academic online magazine in Portuguese about economics and economic alternatives published by the Amilcar Cabral Intervention Center for Development, SIDAC. The aim of this publication is to provide information, reflections, and tools that enable a better understanding of the capitalist system and its impacts on people's lives and on the environment in the geopolitical North and South, favoring critical thinking and individual and collective solidarity positions and practices, both locally and globally. My name is Ana Luisa Silva. I am a researcher in development studies and one of the co-founders at Oficina Global, a research to action initiative based at the University of Lisbon, focusing on international development cooperation and social transformation processes. I will be leading the conversation today with the help of Maria Fera from SIDAC. Hi, Maria.
Hello.
Today, we will be talking about the links between innovation, development, and justice with Theo Papaiuano, Professor of Politics, Innovation, and Development at the Open University in the UK. Theo is a political scientist, and he is also co-director of the Inogen Institute, a collaboration between the University of Edinburgh and the Open University that produces high-quality research and supports the delivery of innovation that is environmentally and economically sustainable, safe, and useful for society. Hi, Theo.
Hello, Anna, and hello, Maria, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in the discussion, which is interesting and very timely.
Thank you both for joining the conversation today. So I really wanted to just jump into the conversation, which, like Theo said, is very timely. Can we maybe start by defining what is these two concepts that we will be addressing, one of the two concepts we will be addressing here today, innovation and development. Theo?
Certainly. What is innovation? Innovation is mainly about novelty. It's about new things, new development, new products, new processes, but also sometimes old things, doing them in new ways. So innovation as such is about the restless efforts of human beings to improve their social, economic, and technical environment. And innovation has been always happening. But since the Industrial Revolution, innovation has been accelerating with successive revolutions which have had impact on human well-being. Now, development, on the other hand, is about change, but not just technological change. Development is about social, political, economic change, and quite often it's about disruptive change that has been influenced by developments in new technologies, in new innovations. And so when we talk about innovation and development, we have to think about two concepts which are very much interrelated.
And if we think about these two concepts over time, you mentioned the Industrial Revolution as a key point and the evolution of innovation, but it is also a key moment in the evolution of development. And perhaps there are other moments that we can look at in development policy that affect the way these two concepts evolve and become more and more closely intertwined.
Yeah, so if you look at thinkers, perhaps starting from Adam Smith, going to Karl Marx, all the way to Joseph Schumpeter, Karl Polanyi, and more recently, Chris Freeman, they all agree that this phenomenon, which have constant improvement on the conditions of human lives, are phenomena which are not static. They are evolutionary phenomena. And so some of these phenomena are developmental phenomena with what they call capital D development, which is more about top-down political interventions in the developmental process of societies, and some other times with small d, which are much more bottom-up, incremental developments within societies. Now, innovation in parallel can be thought this way. It can be thought as innovation with capital I, where you have strong intervention from the state in terms of research and development, for example, to develop certain technologies. But you can also think of innovation with small I as a bottom-up process where you have very small incremental innovations which play a role in the lives of the people. So you have to think of these interrelated processes as evolutionary historical processes. Now, they're not always continuous processes. There are a lot of discontinuities. However, they are not static, and they all influence each other.
Can I just ask if you can give some example, like just quickly to figure out this bottom-up improvement and innovation processes, because I think it's...
So you might think of all these innovations which have taken place since the Industrial Revolution, since the 18th century, and you've got to think a range of new technologies, from industrial textiles to railways to electricity to medicines to ICTs, more recently 3D printing, nanotechnologies, perhaps artificial intelligence. Now, all these innovations have had tremendous impact on human well-being. But there have been other innovations, also smaller innovations, which have had impact on human well-being, whether these innovations have been about, for example, improving sanitation conditions in certain societies, or improving small things in the infrastructure. So it's not just about top-down, perhaps, technologies, high technologies always. It's also about small incremental improvements in the conditions of living of human beings, and combined all these, I think they make the case for what I was saying before, this interrelation between innovation and development. So innovation, in other words, is not just technological innovation. It's also about non-technological, perhaps, processes, doing things differently, because some things we're doing fail to work the way we want them to work, and then we decide to do them differently. And I think we have all these historical examples from all societies where people realize that doing things in different ways, or combining different materials for doing things, actually become better in terms of dealing with problems on the ground.
So in this sense, innovation can be seen in a quite generic way, in this sense. So how does it become seen as such an integral part of capitalist society? When does that happen?
It is because innovation has been directly linked to this notion of economic growth and utility. And that's, of course, the essence of capitalism. It is about generating capital, generating growth, and accumulating, of course, capital. And so the link between innovation and growth and utility has been from the very beginning. But this is the link between one type of innovation, which is more about the industrial, perhaps, innovation. And the idea has always been that by innovating more, by commercializing our innovations, we generate growth, and somehow this growth will trickle down and everyone would be benefited. And now this is not just within countries, but also between countries. So the idea is that if you innovate in the global north, somehow these innovations will arrive to the global south and everyone will have the benefits. But unfortunately, it doesn't work this way. And I think development on the other side has pointed out that you need to do something about that to happen. It doesn't happen automatically. And perhaps what you need to do is to think about more justice terms that you have to apply and to justify action, political action, but quite often also action from the bottom up in order to change or to equalize the ways that innovation diffuses in different societies.
So in this sense, we bring another concept into the discussion, which is the concept of justice, and which is something that you worked extensively about. How would you define justice, and how have you worked the concept of justice in the context of the innovation and development debate?
Yes, so what is justice? Justice is not a new idea. Since the time of Plato and Aristotle, justice has always been conceived as the moral and political standard of how people ought to conduct themselves in societies. However, even though principles of justice have always been very important for social and political action, this area of innovation has always been very difficult area for applying justice. And this is not only because innovation is unpredictable, is an evolutionary process, but also because of what we call quite often as value neutrality, which is the idea that in technical processes, when you develop technological products, think, for example, of a mobile phone, right? Think about a smartphone. When you develop a smartphone, the idea is that you don't think about moral values. You don't have political values. You just focus on the technical process. But that's actually not the case, because there is no such thing as value neutrality. Even the methodologies that we're using to develop certain innovations include values. Let's stick with this example of the mobile phone, right? It is the case that a lot of these technologies have been using minerals extracted from developing countries, especially countries like Congo, for example. And some of these minerals are called conflict minerals. Why? Because there are mining companies exploiting the conflict situations and the instability in some of these countries, and they extract these minerals and they sell them to other companies in the global north. Now, without this kind of minerals, these technologies wouldn't flourish. So someone who comes from a perspective of non-value neutrality, let's say, would take account of this fact. But someone who thinks that innovation is just a technical process wouldn't go further to investigate where those components come from, what kind of relations take place in order for these components to be extracted, what kind of benefits the people who extract those components, those local communities get. So I think thinking about innovation as a process that also raises concerns about justice is something that we should be doing. We were not doing it that much in the past, but I think that's a substantial change between the current thinking of innovation and what we were thinking innovation in the past. There is, in other words, some kind of normative turn, as we call it, in innovation studies, from the point that we were thinking about innovation as just, technical processes to deliver new technologies. We have started interrogating a lot of these processes from more justice perspective, and actually development studies have contributed a lot to that, because development studies have in their heart some element of justice, some element of equality, which we have to address.
Can I just ask something, because I'm this approach to justice and innovations show really well how, as you finished to say, everything is informed by values, even though when they are not so explicit. And in this sense, I have the sensation in many times that we are more and more surrounded by a dominant narrative which make of the innovation word itself, innovation concept itself, a value, an horizon that we have to pursue at all costs. And we have a lot of costs, and we have different benefits, and we have a lot of questions that can guide us to understand which kind of innovation we want to pursue, and which kind of innovation for who is benefiting from that, and what is the benefit. Because if, as you were saying, if innovation is something that exists since the beginning of human beings, and we never stop innovating, it's certain that starting from the Industrial Revolution, innovation was used for certain purposes and for a certain economical system. So I just wanted to add in this thoughts, asking if you think that we can, matching innovation and justice, we can redetermine the meaning of innovation, but with making more explicit the values that we want to follow, and which justice also we want to reach. I don't know if
yes. So I'm one of those who argue for more inclusive types of innovations which ought to take on board the needs and the aspirations of the poorest sections of society. Innovation has been traditionally, at least since the Industrial Revolution, since it has become a very important component of capitalism, has been about profit in essence. But then this doesn't mean that it doesn't raise questions around justice. And also it doesn't mean that all innovations are good by definition, just because they sell well in the market. In fact, it's true that you can argue that in the public discourse, innovation has been something that has become synonym of progress, of goodness, but that's not actually the case. Take, for example, all these new technologies, what has been called fourth industrial revolution. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with the term, but let's use the term to describe all these new digital technologies, all these emerging technologies, which have been already diffusing in different sectors, right? Education, healthcare, logistics. In terms of development, we have a lot of humanitarian applications of these technologies, or we have lots of health technologies creating value. We talk about personalization of treatments. We talk about new data and interventions, which can even be better than the interventions of medical doctors. Okay, so all these new technologies, then people say, are technologies for progress. Yet all these technologies, of course, or the majority of them, have a component of profit. In order to get them, you have to pay for them. But it's not only that. They raise a lot of moral and political issues around exclusion, around injustice, right? Challenging perhaps fundamental values of fairness, of privacy, of autonomy. There is a fast-growing literature that demonstrates how these artificial intelligence and machine learning technologies automate racial profiling, discrimination against people, foster surveillance and fairness. In fact, undermine very much what we call human dignity and well-being. And so, given this evidence, you have to think about what kind of justification we have in order to intervene to rectify these injustices. So we have to identify the injustices from these technologies, but also intervene in order to change these technologies. Now, I've been arguing for a long time, and of course, it's not me who argues that. I mean, it's quite well known that innovations create winners and losers. They can produce great inequality, but the inequality they produce, it's not only because some people will be profited from other people. It's not only because innovations come with profit. It's also because innovations influence the relations between people in societies. So inequalities are not only inequalities in terms of resources, in terms of the profits people make because of certain innovations, but I would say there are winners and losers, not only in terms of resources, but also in terms of relations. Some people are disadvantaged by innovations because they are not enabled to develop their own, perhaps, capabilities to do the things that they want to do, just to use the language of Amartya Sen. So I propose this notion of relational justice as a way to move forward, because, of course, in capitalist settings, you might still want some kind of growth, but you also want to develop some kind of equal relations between people. And it's very difficult to bring these things together. If you come from an innovation perspective, you obviously focus on growth and utility. That's the traditional value inside this notion of innovation. But if you come from a very developmental perspective, you might want to focus more on inclusion and equality. How do you bridge this? You listen to all these discussions about governments that they want to increase growth, but then there are people like ourselves who question that from more developmental perspective. And they say, look, it's not development just to have growth and exclude so many people from many things. You've got to ensure that you have some kind of an equalization process in order for people to be able to participate in this growth. And my argument is that if you use perhaps a notion of relational justice, you might be able to bring these two things together. Because I think relational justice takes the view that each member of society ought to stand in equal relations to other members of society. So proponents of this kind of relational egalitarianism, I would call it, proponents such as Elizabeth Anderson have criticized the distributive notion of egalitarianism that holds that perhaps each member of society ought to enjoy equal share of resources everywhere. That's perhaps not possible. And perhaps it's not feasible either, because people have different needs. So then relational justice demands that we should be concerned with distributing equally material benefits of innovation and development only so long as this equalization eliminates hierarchies, oppression, domination in our societies. So, for example, if, let's say, distributing equally laptops, software, many other kinds of equipment help people in their relation to other people in the area of education, let's say, or in the area of health, then that's fine. But what if they don't? And what if exclusions from participating, from accessing this kind of goods are based on hierarchies, are based on discriminations because of race, because of gender, because of all these things. So perhaps then we have to start from there, and we have to see to what extent some of these relational inequalities are influenced by distributional inequalities. So in this particular example, the distribution of laptops or the distribution of other resources, right? Is someone using the laptop to discriminate against someone else, for example? Because the fact is that even if you manage to equalize everyone, put everyone in a flat resource inequality, you might still not avoid having this kind of relational inequality. So that's why I'm putting forward this idea.
Can I ask one question related to the production of technologies? Now, there is one basic inequality when it comes to the development of new technologies, and that to an extent relates to the unbalance or inequality between North and South, between rich and poor countries. Now, and that's also a form of relational inequality, right? Are there some examples maybe of initiatives that counteract this? Because it brings me back to Maria's questions about, okay, has innovation become this value per se, right? Has innovation become this idea? Some authors also talk about imaginaries of development, imaginaries of innovation, and innovation has become so powerful as a narrative that it's almost an imaginary per se. You're not questioning what type of innovation you want. You just want the innovation per se and the technology per se, right? Are there actually movements that are counteracting this and that are starting from a different point of view that is more inclusive and that is more concerned with what do we want as well-being? What do we want as development?
Yes. So when it comes to inequality between countries, which is resource and relational inequality, as you said, traditionally, we have what has been called aid. Okay, there are certain actions, in terms of technology transfer, in terms of resources from the north to the south. And traditionally, the idea has been that by transferring resources from north to south, you deal with these problems of inequality. But there has been some criticism of that particular policy practice, aid, especially aid that comes from countries which used to be colonial powers towards former colonies. That's one part of criticism. The other part of criticism has been that this kind of redistribution of resources ignores agency on the ground, ignores the fact that these societies are not completely hopeless. They're not hopeless at all, in fact, because there are movements from the societies which actually target particular problems and innovate in order to deal with those problems. In order to conceptualize these movements, we came up with two particular notions. One is the notion of frugal innovation. The other is the notion of grassroots innovation. Frugal innovation is when small-scale entrepreneurs produce or commercialize technologies which are deprived of their luxurious aspects, and they focus mainly on problems. There are so many cases there, so I would refer as an example to the case of computer-based functional literacy. Is a system that was developed by Data, the company in India, to deal with a high number of illiterate people in some villages in India. Or I would refer to the irrigation pump that was introduced by an NGO actually called Kickstart, and enable lots of poor farmers in Kenya to irrigate their fields. Or I would refer to the so-called Ogun tractor in Cuba that enabled lots of farmers actually to deal with the problem of transportation, but also the problem of cultivation of their fields. Now, all these small frugal technologies, of course, come at a price, but at a very low price that some of the local communities can afford, and they deal with problems on the ground. And some of these problems actually cannot be resolved by applying technologies from the global north, because these technologies have been developed not with the context of the local communities in mind. They have been developed from a very north perspective. Then you have these other sort of innovations which develop from the grassroots. They're very much community type of innovations. You don't have, perhaps, at the initial stage, companies to be involved to develop those technologies, but the local technologies, the local communities develop those technologies, whether they are technologies to deal with health problems on the ground, like using traditional medicine, for example, or other type of problems. I think they are very, very, very important, because there is a kind of knowledge pool at that level, and there is a sharing of knowledge in order for these technologies to be developed, but also because they have some kind of political dimension there. They are very much critical of market processes which commercialize those technologies. Now, the state in some aspects has taken a role there. There have been some public policies from the state. So I could mention the example of India, for example, that established the National Innovation Foundation. That was through the Department of Science and Technology. And what did this National Innovation Foundation did? It supported about 345,000 small innovations. That's quite important if you think that otherwise those innovations would go unidentified. Or you have the example of Brazil, the Ministry of Science and Technology of Brazil, that has been very supportive of very similar technologies, and the so-called social technology network that was some time ago. So you do have this, but you also have many other cases of this type of innovations which have been completely ignored by the state, by governments, but also by the scientific and technological elite. And there may be different reasons for that. And one reason may be even epistemological, because, of course, it's very difficult to come to terms with processes of knowledge which are not mainstream processes of knowledge which are not what we identify as scientific processes of knowledge, but processes of knowledge which very much come from the bottom up, from communities which have different sort of ethical frameworks. So, for example, if you think of sub-Saharan Africa and ethical frameworks like Ubuntu, where the essence of this framework is the collective sharing of ideas and resources, then you realize that, you know, it's got nothing to do perhaps with this kind of very individualistic, rationalistic approach that we use in order to think about more top-down technological innovations. Yes, so I think we shouldn't ignore what's coming up from the bottom up.
Yeah, I wanted to make bridge with what you were saying, because in the magazine we try to explore from different perspectives how to decodify the economic system and how the economic system deal with our everyday lives and fields of work, of interest, of on the many aspects of our lives. And in one of the I can refer to at least two contents, to two things that we meet in this path during this project, that were the struggle of some grassroots movement in Africa to propose a different way of interpretation of what is development and what is innovation for their communities, which is in Tanzania especially. There's a big movement against the Jacob pipeline, which is a big project of pipeline on Eastern Africa. And there are a lot of communities which will a lot damaged by this project, and that are facing the brutality of capitalistic interests and trying to propose a different interpretation of development and innovation for their communities. And they are self-organizing, bottom-up, struggling and proposing also at the scientific level new researches, new data, new interpretation of what is really needed. And that was interesting because I think it's another example we can add to how we can interpret innovation and try to fight for a justice intended innovation example and processes. But another thing that I was thinking about is in another context we deal with with the different interpretation that historically and also in the literature of this field of the studies, we can find about development. We live nowadays and since some decades in a globalized world. So we especially in Europe and in North Europe, we are still a lot oriented to see problems on with a center and then the peripheries, no? So development studies also encounter a lot of difficulties in propose different things in a globalized world when the problems are all connected and the system will create it as well. But at the same time, we need different response for same problems or for different impacts that the same problems has on different communities. So in another part of the magazine, we propose to look at also the Ubuntu philosophy and between others, and other example of self-determination, also communities' proposal of what it's needed and what it's their intents and their freedom and their right to intend the development as they need. So I think it's also interesting to see how in many cases we need another interpretation, not just of innovation, but also of justice, and maybe start thinking about justices, because as the impacts are different, as the needs are different, also maybe justices are different. It's really hard to impose or think as a effectively way, a unique solution, a unique interpretation, a unique imagination also of what could work. It was just in the sense, and I don't know if in your researches, that was a little bit the question, you also met different response, different example of possible resolution of problems at the same problem, because it is also really interesting, I think.
Yes, you're raising a very important point here, and perhaps I've mentioned that. Perhaps I've raised this also implicitly, I would say, because the point I've been trying to make is that we tend to push down just one model of innovation. That's the model of innovation that has become dominant since the Industrial Revolution, and it's the model of innovation that basically reproduces capitalism as a system. But for the same problems that we try to deal with by using that model of innovation, there are many other solutions which have been ignored. And the solutions surface only when the models of innovation that we are using in the global north don't arrive to the global south. And they don't arrive not for any other reasons, but because big companies, multinational companies sometimes, which are trading these models of innovation, don't see a market in the global south. So these kind of innovations cost quite a lot. And then, because at the bottom of the pyramid, the so-called bottom of the pyramid, for example, only few companies go, you see the activity from the bottom of the pyramid that has results, resolves some of the problems on the ground by using completely different philosophy, using completely different epistemology. And that's what's interesting. And also, you have to think, how is it possible for some of these different approaches to innovation to scale up from the bottom up? and perhaps in some respects sideline those hierarchical models of innovation, R&D-driven models of innovation, which don't really work in certain communities. As I said before, in some contexts, the state has become very active. In some other contexts, the state hasn't taken any role for this, but the fact is that there is not just one model of innovation. There are different models of innovation and different interpretations of innovation and development. It's just that we have tended to work with one model of innovation that has sidelined all the other models of innovation. And in some respects, our models of innovation, the dominant models of innovation, have failed. Because when you have about 700 million people still in extreme poverty, then something has gone wrong with our innovation-driven economic growth approach, because the economic growth approach that we have is very much innovation-driven within capitalism. That's what can be called the Schumpeterian model of innovation, which is very much the profit kind of model of innovation that has been promoted. So we have, we got used to work with these dominant models, and we have forgotten that there have been other models, on the ground playing their own part in improving the lives of the people and, pushing them up in the social and economic ladder. And I think, although I must mention that in the past, there was work that acknowledged that. So the whole idea of the appropriate technology movement, for example, was that. It's just that along the way, somewhere it was forgotten. And now we think again about this kind of approaches that acknowledge the work that is going on in the Global South, in certain communities, providing different interpretations of innovation and development, and providing, more importantly, alternatives to the dominant models of innovation. I think research from our side, from the academic side, has to do much more in order to highlight those alternatives of innovation and development, those models which provide solutions to certain communities, and perhaps persuade governments that public policy should look at it and should try to perhaps scale up some of these technologies which evidently equalize relations between people, but in general they improve the lives of the people.
Yes, maybe the alternative development model we can propose is just a world where many worlds can fit, which is sometimes I have the feeling that we fail also because we in a very plural way have the ambitions to get a model strong enough to compete with the dominant model we have. But this is a kind of perverse and implicit acceptance of the rules of the game we are in instead of trying another game and trying to find out other rules of the game we want. But it's it's just imaginative also reflection of how we positionate ourselves in the production of lectures and knowledge. Thank you.
So on this note, I was thinking about a question to wrap up maybe. Can we actually rescue innovation from capitalism. So in a sense, it seems like a lot of what we have been discussing is this capture of innovation that has been a concept present throughout human life, and I even remember there that as a concept in the social sciences, social innovation came first in this view of economic growth driven innovation, right? And it was much more negative pre-French Revolution, for example. They would see innovation as something inherently political, something that was going to come and question the status quo. So can we actually bring back that political aspect of innovation and rescue it from this one-size-fits-all approach? What do you think, Theo?
Yes, well, one thing to say, I think, is recognize, of course, that innovation hasn't been the privilege of capitalism. There has been innovation in many different years. It's just that capitalism has accelerated innovation because of the competitive element of the markets and the idea of commercializing innovation for profit. So this constant innovation in order to increase profit and in order to manage for companies to remain in the market. But innovation can be rescued in the sense that it can become much more political, as you have suggested, by including the constraints of innovation, or, if you like, obligations which have to do with justice and equality at all levels. What does it mean? It means that it's not inevitable that innovation will always produce winners and losers to the extent that it does now. This notion of creative destruction that has been introduced by Joseph Schumpeter is very much correct, but then, of course, the question is, what do you do with that? How do you deal with that? Well, unless you have a political approach to this notion of creative destruction, you just simply accept that innovation creates winners and losers and nothing's wrong with that. But the idea of justice is telling you that there is something wrong with that, because it's not necessarily fair to have this gap between winners and losers, not only, as I was saying before, at the level of resources, but also at the level of relations between people. I think perhaps contemporary innovation studies face some kind of social relevance deficit, simply because they haven't been questioning enough the this winners and losers consequence of innovation. This winners and losers consequence of innovation, by the way, is the underlying cause of all these grand challenges we are talking about in the 21st century. Whether this grand challenge is about socioeconomic inequality, whether this grand challenge is about environmental unsustainability. I mean, the very cause of that has to do with the acceptance, in some respects, with the acceptance that there will always be winners and losers. Now, this is not inevitable necessarily, and that's where the role of politics comes in. That's where the justification from a justice perspective comes in and tells that actually, if you have a mechanism to identify the injustices, and you have a kind of threshold where you say, well, look, this is not perhaps acceptable from a justice perspective, some kind of rectification has to happen. Then, of course, you might say that nothing is possible, but it is possible to do this. And I think innovation studies, or perhaps what we have started calling critical innovation studies, has a role to play there. And that role is bringing these elements of justice in thinking about innovation and development.
Thank you. I actually think that that is a quite positive way to end this conversation, because it brings our choice and our agency to the forefront of the discussion, that again sometimes seems a bit left out, to this idea that, you know, it's just a given innovation that we must do it. How? It's not so much talked about. So thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us, Theo. It has really been a pleasure, and I think it really has helped unpack this complex relationships between innovation, capitalism, development, and ideas of justice. And I think it was also very good that we took inspiration from real examples that are actually proposing alternative pathways for innovation processes that are more grounded in social justice, that in the end recognize this political nature of innovation. Thank you, Theo.
Thank you very much, Theo. Thank you. It was really
Thank you, Anna
interesting
and
and
Maria.
important.
Thank you. So to explore more content on these and other topics, you who are listening to this conversation can please visit the magazine's website on outreseconomias.pt. And thank you again. Bye.
Thank you.